I got to tell you, tonight's speaker is indeed a rare bird. Peter Pyle grew up in Hawaii. He was the son of an ornithologist himself. He got a bachelor's degree in 1979 from Swarthmore College and then just went off into the wild. Started doing seasonal biology work for many years in places like Hawaii and Micronesia. After he saw some Mongolian desert finches in Nepal, he got really serious about it and settled down to do scientific research in the Farallones, which he will now tell you all about. Between then and now, he has published more than 240 scientific papers as author or co-author, and has authored and co-authored 5 books, including one called The Identification Guide to North American Birds, which is better known among most birders and ornithologists as the Pyle Guide. And with that, let us welcome our guest tonight, Peter Pyle.
All right. Well, thanks, Tim. And as a recent local resident here for about the last year in Fort Bragg, we're very pleased to be here and very pleased to be involved with the Science Center as well as Mendocino Coast Audubon, which Tim's involved with a lot. So as Tim mentioned, I got a lot of slides. I'm going to jump right into it. This talk I kind of was mostly developed between the OOs and 2020 when I last gave it. So it's a little dated, but I figured I freshened it up a little bit, but it's still really relevant. There are some older slides in here, which you'll probably recognize. But anyway, here we go. Oops, let's see. Now, of course, I'm not advancing. There we go. Okay, as Tim mentioned, I had the fortune to grow up in Hawaii and also spent a lot of time on the Farallon Islands. And so my big focus has been marine biology and ornithology. And the Pacific, there's how many square miles the Pacific is. It's a giant ocean. And a lot of the things we want to study are animals that are able to negotiate this ocean in different ways. And that's what this talk will mostly be about. So we'll start on Midway Atoll, which has a real, interesting history, as well as it's a very special biological place. And Atoll is the mountain of Midway is actually 600 feet below the ocean surface. And this ring of white water you see is the coral reef, which builds up and up and up and continues to have the atoll exist, despite the fact that the island itself has sunk well below the sea level. And that's that's a kind of characteristic of atolls and of the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, especially Midway's the second to the last one. It's about 1,200 miles west-northwest of Oahu. So on the island, we have albatross, and lots of them. They're locally known by the naval personnel and others who have spent time there as the Goonies. And one question ornithologists have always had is how can two species that are so similar, black-footed on the left and laysan on the right, coexist and breed together and not have one outcompete the other? And which is usually what happens when two species come into the same place. So one of the questions we sought to answer was that one, and I'll provide the answer in a little bit. You had a talk recently, the Audubon Society, by John Plissner, and he filled you in on all the happenings on Midway with albatross. So I'll make this pretty brief. In November, both species, the laysans here, come in and dance and find their mates. And when they do, once they've found their mates, they settle down rather quickly. Most of the dancing you see on videos and stuff from Midway are not adults, but young birds, because it takes them 3 or 4 years to find their mate and start breeding. So, and that's when they really dance. And then once they found their mate, they only have to dance for a couple minutes to make sure they're doing the right one. So each species has a different dance, and each individual does too. And by the dances, they can be sure they've found their mate. And this all happens in November, and they're very synchronous. All the birds come in the same 2 week period and start to do this. Here's the black-footed dance. You can see it's rather different from that of the Laysan. So one of the marquee birds on Midway is this Laysan albatross that's been named Wisdom, and it was banded at adult in 1956. So it's at least 74 years old. Is that right? Yeah, at least 74 years old in 2025. And this year it came back and laid an egg and hatched a chick. She hasn't been doing that well recently at fledging chicks, but she's still going. So that's pretty incredible. By March, the chicks are about this age, kind of fuzzy. And because there's no mammalian or other predators on these islands and the colonies are so big, the adults can afford to both leave and go find food for the chick at this point. And so that's another part of the story we'll talk about. And then by July, they've gained most of their feathering. They only have a little bit of down left, and then they typically fledge in late July and August. And then we start seeing the juveniles here usually in October. So one of the stresses for albatross that we've heard a lot about is the amount of plastic that's floating around in the Pacific. And so there's a lot of attention on that. And what happens is that the adults pick up this plastic, thinking it's fish or squid. Sometimes the plastic might have a film of marine uh, zooplankton or something on it, which makes it seem like it's edible. And they bring it back to their chicks, and then they feed the chicks, and the chicks don't die directly from the plastic. But what happens is it fills their stomach so much that they can't have enough liquid in their system to hydrate, and they actually die from dehydration after consuming this much plastic. So a big concern, another reason why we need to do all that we can to prevent plastic from occurring in the oceans. And one of the things we did with Midway, these are our kids, was to go around the beaches and pick up all this plastic netting. Netting entangles the monk seals there, which is, another problem. And then we put it all on a barge and ship it off. So that's a great effort that's ongoing there. And now they're also going in the water and trying to clean up netting that's down caught on the coral reefs and stuff as well. So by June, the albatross are feeding their chicks, and one of the questions, that question of how do they differentiate has to probably do with food. So what we wanted to do was test that out. Now there's a third species of albatross in the North Pacific, the short-tailed, and John talked a lot about that, and we've been talking a lot about that here because we're starting to see them here off our shores. But back in the OOs, they put up decoys. You can see if you can see which ones here are the decoys and which is the real one. The real one's there in the middle. And those decoys were put up and they had sound blasting and actually were able to get albatross to come. And the first pair that bred involved an adult with a yellowhead and a subadult, or maybe a 5, 6 year old in front with the brown head. And they actually produced a chick that year, and I'll show you pictures of that in a little bit. So as I mentioned, we have been seeing short-taileds. The story of them is very interesting. They were thought extinct until the early 1950s when Japanese meteorologists went out to Torishima Island and found a few that had not been collected by feather hunters. And then they protected the short-tailed albatross and dedicated themselves to bringing it back. So from a few, maybe 10 or 20 birds back in the 50s, the numbers now are about 7,000 and maybe more. And so we're starting to see more and more here off of Fort Bragg in the Noyo Canyon. Here are 4 of them that we've seen in the last 6 months. Just the last 3 of them there on our Noyo pelagics trips, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So one big event for Midway and the Albatross, and this was the same year, March, that the first short-tailed chick was produced out there, was the earthquake and tsunami from Japan. And this is what it looked like there. And here, this map shows how much of Sand Island on the left and eastern and the entirety of the small Spit Island was covered by the tsunami during that event. And unfortunately, what it did was it killed a lot of Laysan albatross chicks because they were pretty small. And in other cases, it bunched them all up. And some of them found their way, in fact, quite a few of them found their way back to their territories. And the way adults are able to communicate with their chicks is by voice. So when the adults come in, they give a call and the chick recognizes it. And then the chick gives a call, then the adult recognizes it. And that prevents them from feeding the wrong chick. But in this case, it was helpful because the adults would walk around calling, and when the chick heard, they'd run over and then they'd reunite and usually go back to the territory. But it was kind of a disaster overall for the albatross there, not to mention some of the other birds that nest in burrows at that time. Luckily, March, there's not a whole lot of nesting, but probably the bone-in petrels had a lot of chicks that were drowned as well during that event. However, the short-tailed albatross not only is a bigger species, but it gets going a little bit earlier. So it was the only bird that managed to hold on to its territory during the tsunami. And you can see in the background some of the decoys were all thrown around and everything. So this is what it looked like the day after the tsunami. It actually had gotten pushed about 200 yards from its natal site. So the wildlife personnel out there got permission to take a little sled out. It's an endangered species, so they couldn't really manhandle it too much, but they coaxed it onto a sled, a little plastic like boogie board or something, and then pulled it 200 meters to where the adults were. And then the adults came back and started feeding it, and it actually successfully fledged this year. So there's another shot of the short-tailed albatross chick on the right, and in this case, this is a black-footed albatross chick on the left, which is a little bit frostier than the Laysan chicks. So another thing with the tsunami was the amount of plastic that originated from the earthquake and the tsunami, and they were able to track that plastic coming across the Pacific and actually coming off of California in March of 2016. And a lot of you have heard of the garbage patch that's out there. It's a little bit south of where it was that year. So a lot of it probably ended up down there. And it's this big section of the Eastern Pacific Ocean that just got tons of garbage that ends up accumulating there because of the currents. So that's an area that people are focused on and trying to figure out how to clean up. Another conservation issue with the albatross is longline fisheries, and thankfully we were able to um, pass some regulations. This is the way they used to do it with baits and lines going along with baited hooks right on the surface. And what would happen was the albatross would grab the hooks and get pulled under. But since then, there are new regulations that most fishermen are following, where you have to send the long line down in a tube and have it go underwater, so it's never on the surface and can't get grabbed by the albatross. So all of our studies, and this began in the late 90s, were to start tracking these albatross. And back then, this is what was first used, these microwave telemetry devices that would be harnessed onto their necks and go around. Now, the problem with this one is that you have to get the thing back to get the data off of the tracking device. Now, of course, we have devices that we can put on birds and mammals that actually transmit the data back to satellites and right to our computer. So the researchers can just sit at their computer and every day check in where the birds are, and that's pretty cool. Here's a shot of a black-footed albatross off of California wearing one of the transmitters. So the early study on this, and this was when we were out on Midway, actually was occurring on Turn Island, a little bit to the southeast of Midway, about halfway back to Honolulu. And so they put a transmitter on, and it from February 5th to 14th, it went up and around and came back. So not much. At this point, the chick's pretty small. So it didn't need a lot of food yet. It came back, it fed its chick, it immediately turned around, flew out to sea, and spent a month at sea. And during that month, it went all the way to California and spent 2 or 3 weeks off of California, right off our coast here, and then returned all the way back to Turn Island to feed its chick. And so this was a big monumental kind of leap of understanding, is that these black-footed albatrosses come all the way to California and the California current to find food for their chicks and return to the Northwest Hawaiian island. And so then it spent one day with the chick. It actually spent most of that time away from the nest preening. The chicks are at this point pretty large and kind of obnoxious, trying to pester the adults a lot. So the adults, in this case, the adult flew out into the lagoon and sat there and preened for a day, and then headed up and spent another month going around getting food for its chick. So this is pretty incredible. So when we go on our Noyo pelagic trips between February and July now, we see a lot of these old bleached breeding black-footed albatrosses, and we like to tell the story that, hey, there's a bird that's trying to get food for its chick way over in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands. So I calculated from Midway how much of a round trip that is, and it's 6,922 miles round trip. So you ask, how do albatross do this? I mean, why? How? Well, why is because in this time of year we have upwelling in an incredibly nutritious uh, ecological cycle here, and so that ends up producing a lot of food. By contrast, the middle of the Pacific, which is called the gyre, is warmer water, relatively unproductive, almost like a desert. So instead of foraging over this very unproductive water, they found that it's more economical to come all the way to where there is food and then return to feed their chicks from that food. Here's a day of big upwelling, and the blue represents colder water. So what upwelling is nutrient-rich water that comes up from the surface, from the depths, and then hits the sunlight at the top, and that creates a phytoplankton bloom that then creates a zooplankton, and then feeds the food chain on from there. And Noyo Canyon, I think, is got something going on there because it's so productive all the time. And I think what happens is the upwelling brings the waters right up the canyon. You can kind of see up here toward the top that there's a lot of upwelling that occurs north of Point Arena. So that might be why we have such productive waters here for not just marine life, but fishing as well. So how do albatross do this? Well, if the winds are right, and they usually are during this time, it's all been, they've all adapted to this strategy. They can basically fly from Midway to California, hardly moving a muscle. And if you go out on one of our trips and watch albatross flying around, it's pretty incredible that they just can go tip back and forth. And like a sailboat, if the winds are right, they don't need to use any energy. So that's what these albatross are doing. They pick up the winds, which are usually a little bit north. If you remember, those track lines kind of go north first and then south. Pick up the winds and come all the way here. And it takes them about 4 days to do that. And it's actually recent research is showing that they actually sleep on the wing, or at least half their brain is asleep and the other is half awake, something like that. So they're 3/4 asleep when they're flying. So they pick up on, not only are they able to transit that area, but during that process, it's kind of like a resting period where they catch up with their sleep and with their, not having to use a lot of energy. So that's interesting. This was a graphic I found along the way that kind of shows how albatross fly in different wind patterns, crosswind, upwind, and downwind. And the crosswinds one down at the bottom is the one that they do. And you can see they can just circle around and kind of end up or go up and down and end up going many, many miles without flapping at all. Meanwhile, the chicks are back there, and if you've done the math, there's two parents, so each one's gone a month. So it only gets fed on average once every 2 weeks. And what the birds do when they feed, they process the seafood into this rich, viscous oil that they then cough up to the chicks. So it's like filling up the gas tank once every 2 weeks. And meanwhile, the chicks are just out there. There's no predators. They often clump up and hide under a bush, get out of the sun for a while, and then sleep and so on. But they're growing all the while because they've been tanked up. And then the adults are able to find them through the calling once they come in. Okay, so the transmitter work, what did we find out? Well, yellow in this map is Laysan albatross. That's where they go from Midway. Green is black-footed albatross. You see that almost all of the Midway birds come to the northwest coast. And then red is the short-tailed albatross. So you can see that they separate ecologically while they're feeding. Meanwhile, it's worth it to go all these miles to breed on Midway because there's no predators there and the temperatures are mild enough that they don't have to incubate and keep the chick warm as much. So what separates these two species is the fact that they largely forage in different areas, and they also forage on different things. The laysan actually turns out to be more of a nocturnal predator, which feeds on squid that come up at night, and the black-footed feeds on a more general array of seafood, fish, squid, and whatnot. And it's a little bigger than the laysan, so potentially it may have pushed the laysan out from coming over to the California current to feed because it's bigger and a little more aggressive. So that's how that goes with the two species that breed on Midway. Okay, so shifting gears, the other spot I've spent 24 years on the Farallones between 1980 and 2024. And it's located, as many of you know, I'm sure, off San Francisco, about 28 miles from the Golden Gate Bridge. And that's Point Reyes in the distance there behind it, which is the closest point of land at 18 miles directly north. In fact, the longitudinal 123 line, 123 degrees line goes right through both the Farallon Lighthouse and the Point Reyes Lighthouse, which is kind of an interesting thing, just purely coincidental since they defined it based in Greenwich in Britain. So what do we have out there? We have 13, I think it says 13 species of breeding seabirds that breed there. And here's a selection of some of them, and a lot of you know these codes too. And what we do with the seabirds is we have a tremendous amount of research that we've done on banding them, how often do they come back, what food are they bringing their chicks, and especially how does this vary from year to year? Because as we know, there's El Niños and La Niñas, and everything varies incredibly in terms of ocean productivity. So what do birds do when, there's an El Nino and the ocean doesn't have a lot of food? And what do they do when there's a La Nina and a lot of upwelling and a lot of food? And, basically it's rather the same story. They have to go farther to get food during El Nino years, and a lot of them just skip breeding altogether. Whereas in La Nina years, they go like crazy, and usually they don't have to go as far. So we call them boom and bust years. Some years, a lot of chicks are produced, and other years, almost no chicks are produced. So all of our studies revolve around all of that variation. And thankfully, we've had a lot of cold water years in the last 25 years. So the populations of seabirds out there now are doing very well. common murre, for instance, our most common bird there, has recently had an estimate of over 300,000 breeding birds there. We also get many species of migrants that go by that we can see, including big masses of sooty shearwaters up in the upper left there, that are seen, usually at this time of year. These giant flocks, I guess they might sometimes get up off our coast. Maybe they will with global ocean warming in future years, but most of the time these giant flocks are seen in Monterey Bay and off of Santa Cruz and San Francisco counties. We also have 6 species of pinnipeds, that variously breed there. 5 species do breed: elephant seal, California sea lion, Steller sea lion, and then Guadalupe fur seal is that little pup in the lower right. We were able to document the first record of Guadalupe fur seal in Northern California back in 1986. And it was a male on the island. Now they're kind of more common off our coast than we had thought before, but I think breeding has only occurred to the Channel Islands and no farther north. However, one of the big stories is the northern fur seal on the Farallones, which which was absent, was breeding there in the 1700s and early 1800s, and then in 1807 and through 1809, ships from Britain and Boston came and just wiped them out pretty much. There was only just a few remaining, and then following that, the Russians from Fort Ross came out and kind of took the rest. And the Russians get blamed for the whole thing, but really it was the Americans and the British that wiped out the colonies, and the Russians just cleaned it up afterwards. So between about 1830 and 1996, there were no fur seals breeding on the Farallones. And then in 1996, over on a remote section of the island, West End, we found our first pup there. And since then, so what is it, like 30 years? In the last 30 years, the colony's grown to over 2,000 or 3,000 pups now on the Farallones. So it's making its way back to historical numbers, although the historical numbers were hundreds of thousands. It's getting there. And an interesting ecological question we have is, as the fur seal colony expands, it's going to kind of take over some of the seabird breeding habitat. So that's just kind of the push and pull that occurs with marine ecosystems, where you get one species dominating for a while, and then something happens and other species take advantage, and so on. So there you go. One thing I was going to mention with Laysan albatross feeding on squid is that their populations really boomed over the last 50 years. And it's now something like 700,000 breeding on Midway alone, and many more on the others. It's much more common there than black-footed, actually. You wouldn't think that from what we see off our coast. But the reason, I think, one hypothesis is that the reason laysans have increased so much is because of our tuna fishery, which has sort of been keeping the tuna fish, the yellowfin and bluefin and albacore numbers low in our oceans, lower than normal, which benefits squid because tuna feed on squid, which in turn benefits Laysan albatross. So there's another example of sort of the dynamics that can occur with ocean ecosystems. I can't read that number at top, but it's like 20 something species of cetaceans have been recorded there. These are some of our common ones: humpback, Dall's porpoise, gray whale, Pacific white-sided dolphin, which just had a name, its scientific name changed, and so on. So it's a really productive place. And why is that? Well, here's kind of an exaggerated look at what the Farallones are. It's a ridge that comes up, and it also includes the Cordell Bank. And that canyon behind Cordell Bank has a lot of upwelling. So that upwelling comes up there, and then the California current kind of moves that productive water south around the Farallones, and also off San Francisco, which is why the fishery there is so big and important. It's one of what we call an eastern it's what we call an eastern boundary current system. And there's 5 of them in the world on these eastern sides of oceans, the western sides of continents. And it's where basically cold water from the north comes down, or in the southern hemisphere, the cold water comes up from the south because Coriolis effect causes currents to go clockwise in the northern Pacific and counterclockwise in the southern. So off the western coasts of South America and Africa and India and California, you get these cold waters coming from the poles toward the equator, and that helps fuel these big ecosystems. I got to the Farallones. My first week was in September of 1980. And about my third day, the biologist there, Phil Henderson, says, "Oh, shark attack." So we look out and there's a scene like this, blood splashing around, big giant fins, tails, dorsal fins. And he goes, "Yeah, we think they're white sharks, great white sharks, but we're not really sure what they are." So this was the state of our knowledge about white sharks at the Farallones in 1980. So the white shark is kind of misnamed. Whoever named it had one upside down in a bin or something, because it's really quite dark above. It's gray to black above. And what it does is it's an ambush predator, and that dorsal coloration allows it to hide as it's swimming around above rocky bottoms in the ocean. And then what it does is when there's a pinniped that's not paying attention up on the surface, it rushes up and strikes it. And these are the only photos that I know of a white shark actually preying upon a California sea lion. And there's a kind of sordid story about these photos, but I won't go into it. And so this is what they do, though. They grab it, and then typically what they'll do after they've grabbed it is wait and make sure it dies, and then the blood, and then once it has died, they'll come back in and start feeding on it. They don't want to risk clawing out their eyes or something else by trying to feed on an animal that hasn't quite been killed yet. And we get a lot of both sea lions and elephant seals that come to the island with these big crescent-shaped shark bites on them. So a lot of them do get away, and actually their healing capacity is pretty incredible. We get some animals come up that you'd never think would survive, and then one female with probably a 3-foot bite out of its back came back the next year all healed up. Well, it was a giant scar, but she was able to pup for a few years after that. So their healing ability in the salt water is pretty incredible. One of our studies, now look at the dorsal fin, the trailing edge of the dorsal fin on this has these notches. And that's allowed us to start, as we started going out and documenting these events more closely, allowed us to identify individual white sharks. And that became a big part of our research out there. So what we do is we got underwater video cameras, and this is like in the dark ages of that technology. And it's probably a VHS outfit in there. But we were able to document them underwater a lot better. It's only pretty rare that their fins come out for a nice photo like this, but we're able to underwater get a lot of photos and identify individual sharks. And so this is some of our data from 2002. The numbers represent the individual shark. And in this way, we were able to document many sharks over many years. That 8907 is one called Cuttail, which we were able to document all the way through first seen in 89 because it had a chopped off caudal fin, and we saw it every year through at least the early OOs, and it never really changed in size during that period at all. One of the big things we learned from this, though, is that we were able to sex them by whether or not they had claspers, and we discovered that the males, individual males, come to the Farallones every year, whereas females only come every other year. And there'll be females there every year, but not the same ones. So we inferred that and the gestation period is calculated to be about 13 months. So we figured they come to the Farallones only every other year, which fits in, and then during their off year, they're off giving birth to pups somewhere, and we still are not quite sure about that. I'll talk about that in a second. One of the early successes we had with our program, and I'm proud of the research we did on these. It's a lot of hype around white sharks, but I think we were able to, for the most part, keep our cool and do objective research on white sharks that really kind of help people to understand. Mostly people understand that they're not these vicious things that are after humans, but just an important part of the ecosystem that helps keep everything pinniped numbers, which in turn keep fish numbers all in balance. There was a boat called the Merva W out of Pillar Point, Half Moon Bay, that came out and started killing white sharks in 1982. And he brought these he came to the Farallones, he shot sea lions illegally, but there was no enforcement back then. He hooked his hooks with the sea lions. He then caught white sharks and took them back to Pillar Point and kind of was lauded as a hero. Now, this was only 7 years after Jaws had come out. And so everybody at that point was of the mindset that any any good shark is a dead shark. So as you can see from our data, these are observations of white shark attacks we had between 1968 and 1982, and all of a sudden there was a giant drop. So it's sort of indicated how vulnerable the white shark population is just to the removal of 4 large animals. So at that point, we showed this graph to congressmen in Sacramento, and they passed a bill protecting white sharks off the coast of California. And that was in 1994. So that was one of our successes with our research, that we were able to affect conservation. Another big thing was the increase in recreational boats to come dive and watch and try to see white sharks, because that's always a big thing. And before 2000, there were no regulations, there was no permitting. People could throw blood in the water, pigs, they were just throwing everything in the water. And there was concern that the mammal blood and stuff that they were throwing in could have pathogens or something that would get into the local pinniped population. So in 1999, 2000, or 2002, the early OOs, we wrote up legislation about this industry and required boat owners to have an educational component to the divers about the importance of white sharks to the ecosystem. And they all had to be permitted, and there were several restrictions. They could not put anything in the water. They couldn't drag decoys around, which is what some of them were doing, to have, decoys shaped like seals, and they drag them around behind their boat, and the sharks would hit those. And so all of that was caused to be illegal. And since then, I think it's been pretty pretty successful in that none of these boats are doing that, and all of them are following the rules. So that was another thing. I used to give a lot of talks to the surf riders, and these are some of the tips I would give them to avoid rocky drop, avoid getting hit by sharks. Salmon Creek is one of the places where there's a lot of white sharks, and it's mostly because of the drop off of the rocks right nearby. But a couple of the ones I really like are: number 5, pay attention to spooked feelings. It turns out that when they talk to survivors of white shark attacks, surfers or divers, a lot of them just before kind of got a spooked feeling, like, I'm in the wrong place. Something's wrong. And, some of them would go in, and I'm out of here, but others didn't, and then they'd get hit. And so I'm wondering, if there's something about the water, something about the environment, something about our extrasensory perceptions that allows us to to think about or to know when there's a white shark below us out in the water. The other one is wear a pinstriped wetsuit, and we, the black wetsuit looks just like a seal, and so we conjectured that if you look less like a seal, um, then you might not get attacked as much. So we came up with pinstriped and checkerboard wetsuit designs. And one of our colleagues actually went to O'Neill and proposed it, but they came back and said nobody wants to look like the Joker in a deck of cards when they're walking around on the beach. It's all about fashion these days, so that never took off. And then finally, surf with a buddy. And the joke there is you don't have to swim faster than the shark, you just have to swim faster than your buddy. So on October 4th, 1997, something happened. This is a Photoshop thing. It's not the real footage, but we had a group of killer whales or orca come in and kill a white shark. And we were able to document it pretty thoroughly. And that was a big sensation, a big event that occurred. But what happened afterwards was even, I think, more important, and that's that all of the white sharks took off from the Farallones. We had only 2 sightings after that date in 1997 versus, many more average sightings during other years. So definitely there was a connection between that attack and all of the white sharks taking off. So that's become of great interest to people who want to, repel white sharks or, come up with devices or whatnot to lessen the chances of white sharks attacking people on popular beaches. And so there was quite a bit of interest in this. And uh, so that gets into our tagging next, and I'll get back to the orca thing in a little bit. Beginning in the early OOs, we started actually putting tags on white sharks to see where they go. Nobody had any idea where the Farallon animals went when they weren't at the Farallons. They're quite seasonal there. They show up in July and are there pretty much through November, and then they're just not there at all in the spring. So we wanted to know where they went in the spring. And these are called pop-up archival tags. So they collect data on the shark while it's moving around, and then are programmed to float to the surface, and transmit the data back by satellite. There's yet to be technology to be able to do this all underwater. So this is the best we could do as far as finding out where the white sharks go. And it worked pretty well. So here's our research boat with a white shark called White Slash behind it. She's a female. The females there, besides claspers, have a lot of bite marks on the side from mating with the males come over their backs and grab their sides. Mating's never been seen in white sharks, but this is what other sharks do, and the evidence is here that white sharks do it as well. And if you look closely, right here is the tag. This tag is 8 inches long. So you get an idea of how big some of these. White Slash we figured was about 19.5 feet long. And they're very girthy, they're almost like the size of a school bus in both girth and length. And the females especially are bigger than the males and wider as well. So we were able to start getting data. This was our very first tag, and it popped up after 2 weeks, and we got the tag back, found on a beach, and this is what we were able to get, the kind of data we were able to get. The pink represents daylight. So here's night, here's dawn, here's the day, here's dusk, and here's night. And as you can see, the white shark's obviously a lot more active underwater during the day than the night. So that was kind of an early thing we were able to find out, which, we'd have no idea how to know that otherwise. So we put a couple tags on, popped up quick right around the Farallons. Then the third tag popped out way out here in the Pacific, and we were a little surprised because normally we thought they were going east or north south like all the other animals do off here, most of them. And then the fourth one also popped out here. And so we were getting really interested in what's going on out here. And then the fifth one popped off between the islands of Maui and Kaho'olavi. And so that just turned everybody upside down. And our first thought was to go to the Hawaii Tourist Bureau and say, how much will you pay us not to release this information? But being good scientists, we ended up publishing this in the journal Nature instead. And this opened everybody's eyes on the fact that white sharks don't necessarily hang around our coast all year. When they're gone from the Farallones, they go way out into the Pacific for whatever reason. So that 5,674 mile round trip for these white sharks, but that's not all of it. So most of those tags were on males that did this, and they returned to the Farallones the next year, which is what we'd expect. But we started wondering if the females might go all the way to the Western Pacific to actually give birth, because it's a lot warmer. They need a certain water temperature to give birth. And there are several records of pregnant and birthing white sharks being caught in nets off of Japan, and no records like that in the Eastern Pacific. So this started making us wonder if potentially the females in their 2-year absence from the Farallones go all the way to Japan, give birth, and then come back. That's still kind of untested. I still think at least some of them probably do this, but we haven't quite got we don't have the tags that can last 2 years yet. So that's what people are working on. Meanwhile, since then, a whole lot more tags have been put on, and here's the overall look at where they go. And this area here, again, where we found out those first two tags, has this, picture this as a big mountain, because there's a bazillion dots right in this area. So both males and females go to this area, and for some reason the researchers from Hopkins Marine Station dubbed it the White Shark Cafe, because they thought, okay, it's a cafe, they're all going there to eat something, but there's nothing there. It's really deep water, there's no seamounts, there's nothing for them to eat. It's in that big unproductive area. So on the Farallones, we came up with a different theory, that they're actually going here to mate. And that's what I think is happening, that they go here to mate in our winter. So December, January, February, they're here. And then the females take off, and it turns out all of these dots way out here in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, here's Midway, by the way, are females, and then the males return. So that's been documented, that that's their pattern. And as yet, we still don't know if the females keep going to Japan or not, or if some of them maybe go south as well. But anyway, we think that the white sharks, both male and female, come here to mate. And you go, well, this is a big area of ocean. How do they find each other? On the Farallones, we see them breach like whales do. They breach out of the water and come back down, plap. And they would do this repeatedly. So it wasn't like missed predation attempts or anything like that. It was actually true breaching. And then the few times we've been able to see what sex is breaching, it's always been males. So I kind of think the males go out there and breach, and that loud slap on the water is a signal to females in the area that here I am. And one interesting thing at the Farallones is the breaching increases through the fall. So we see more breaching in November than in August, September. And also the breaching tends to occur on these sort of bluebird days with clouds in the sky. And we almost think that weather simulates what they're going to see in this area. Swingers bar, the white shark swingers bar, we call it. And that is the breaching is what allows them to find each other. Okay, so then on November 19th, 2000, we had another event where orca came in and killed a white shark. And we happen to have a tag on one of our animals, tipfin. He's one of our more famous animals because we tagged him twice, and both times he went to Hawaii. He was actually that first one that went to Hawaii. And then we tagged him again, and he went to Hawaii again. So they repeat their migration year to year. But we happen to have a tag on him, and on exactly within 2 hours of that other orca attack, he went straight west and over the continental shelf and down and never came back. So this kind of confirmed that there's something going on. And I guess of all the theories, I think the best one might be that the livers of white sharks are giant. They're like Volkswagen bugs in there, and they are very pungent. And I think probably the killing of a white shark maybe releases chemicals from the liver, which alerts all of the other sharks in the area that there's danger and they leave. So that's the best I can come up with. And of course, the folks trying to come up with repellents are interested in reproducing that, because it'd be like a little a mace squirt bottle. You're out there surfing and, oh, white shark, and you squirt some, I don't know. I don't think it's going to be successful. So there are more papers like this based on now on killer whales moving white sharks around, and then its effects, the effects of a killer whale predation on sea lion and seal populations. Okay, so I got a couple shameless, what I'm going to call shameless self-promotions. This is the first one. I do have a talk that I have only given once, unlike this other one, of plants of the Farallon Islands. And this was really fun. I gave it for the CNPS chapter and Yerba Buena chapter, which is San Francisco. And in it, the theme was what happens when birders try and do botany. And so it's kind of fun. We were kind of all over the place until Peter Bay, who some of you know came out in the 90s and straightened us all out. So if anyone would like me to give this talk, I'd be happy to do so. Okay, a few more tagging stories. Bluefin tuna was where the money came from to develop these tags because it's such a commercially viable fish and product. And in this case, the question is, where do they spawn? And once no one knew where they spawned, and the spawning grounds are really important to protect because you don't want fishermen figuring out where those are and going and taking all the pregnant females out, because that's going to put a big dent in the population. So they started putting the tags on. It turns out, and this was another big surprise with these tags, is that the spawning grounds is up here in the Bering Sea off Russia. And then in that first year, the small tuna all go down to here off Baja. And then over several years, they'll make their way back. And then when they're big enough to breed, they'll go back up here as adults. So that was kind of cool. There's a lot of east-west component to this migration. And that's kind of a theme, for all of this tagging stuff, is that we're finding out that these animals have different directions, not necessarily just north-south like most birds do. So what else are we doing with tagging? Well, bar-tailed godwit, here's a good story. We're able to put tags on birds of this size now and able to track them. And here's a story of a bar-tailed godwit. And basically what they found out was that after leaving Alaska, they go straight to New Zealand, one flight. And then from New Zealand in the spring, they'll do several little hopscotches up back to Alaska. And we think it's because there's so much food in Alaska during summer in the tundra area that they're able to super fatten up. And they do. They get so fat that their internal organs sort of get subsumed by fat. So, and then they're able to go to New Zealand. But one of the godwits, which was kind of nutty, left Alaska, flew toward New Zealand. A storm came in, so it turned around and went up all the way up, sort of off China. And then it went, whoops, I'm going the wrong way. Sorry about that. And then turned around again, and then eventually got to New Zealand in 9 days. So that bird was flying for 9 days. And another theme of this that we're finding out is the boom bust thing, where a lot of these animals just fatten up, fatten up, fatten up, fatten up, and then they go for long periods of time without having to eat. And that allows them to cross these vast Pacifics. The white sharks, for instance, we calculate eat 2 or 3 seals per fall off the Farallons, and that should be enough energy to let them go for the rest of the year. And the elephant seals that have also gotten tagged go up to the Gulf of Alaska and really fatten up the big males, and they come back giant, and then they're on the islands cavorting and fighting and whatnot for 6 months without eating anything. So that's kind of a theme here, is that they get really fat and then they're able to go for long periods to do other stuff besides eating. Um, Sooty shearwater is a bird we know really well off our coast here. And it's that one that comes up in swarms, and it comes here mostly to molt. But it turns out, Arctic tern's always been the bird that has the longest migration, quote unquote, because it goes straight from the Arctic to the Antarctic and back. And everyone thought, well, that's the longest migration. How could it be longer? Well, sooties are longer. So they end up leaving the like these this leaving the breeding grounds around New Zealand, going to Chile first, then going all the way up to Japan, then coming around to California, where we get them in summer when they're molting, like right now, and then return to breed starting in October, November, their spring in the southern hemisphere. So turns out that the champion flyer is sooty shearwater, and we only know that because we've been able to put these tags on them. We're also starting to put tags on smaller and smaller birds. Here's a study I was involved with that showed how black-headed grosbeaks go to a molting ground here, they breed here, they go to the monsoonal area to molt, and then after they molted, they go to the non-breeding ground. So basically, they have a three-step migration, confirming what we were starting to learn about this. The lazuli bunting and warbling vireo and ash-throated flycatcher, several of these birds do this molt migration, we call it. And we were able to really document how this occurs with the transmitter. So how small can we get with these transmitters? The technology is getting there to be able to put one on a hummingbird, and that's what I want to see. Is I want to sit in my computer and watch the hummingbird in our neighborhood fly around, because I think that would be pretty cool. And then even insects are being considered. And speaking of insects, there's migrations of insects as well. Somehow in the past, this is called the Kamehameha butterfly, and it obviously is a relative or of the painted lady that we see here. But it's colonized the Hawaiian Islands. So somehow painted ladies in the past got to Hawaii, and now have adapted into a new species out there, the Kamehameha butterfly. So these insects go a long way too. And there's a story, and I was actually involved with it with this one called the globe skimmer. It's dragonfly. And when I was on Curie Atoll here, 2,400 miles from the nearest thing, I was there in 1982, and we had a kind of a front come through, and we had a bunch of olive tree pipits show up, and also thousands of these globe skimmers showed up on Curie. And that was kind of weird. They don't breed there, so they all flew there from the mainland somehow. So I wrote a little paper about it. It was on September 29th, 1983, that this happened. Thousands of them showed up there. And then later I was watching a TED Talk by this guy. I forget his name. I guess it's not there. Charles something, Charles Anderson. That's right. And he documented globe skimmers, this big migration that they do in over the Indian Ocean, sort of like monarch butterflies, where they breed up here. The winds carry them all the way to the coast of Africa, where they breed again. Then they go up here, and somehow there's memory. Each of these, I guess they go all the way to here, Madagascar, then go north and breed here, and then those guys go here. So there's some sort of a between year memory or knowledge about where they should go each year that's different with each group of insects. So he did his work in the Maldive Islands here, and where there also was a big migration of globe skimmers. So this was sort of like what we saw in Curie. And what was really cool is that a couple species of birds, European hobby, and I think it's red-footed falcon, follow these big migrations of globe skimmers, and actually do their migration in connection with them and are able to catch them on the wing and eat, so they can eat during their migration all the way across the Indian Ocean, which is kind of interesting. And here's the same thing I mentioned. We had like 12 to 15 olive-backed pipits suddenly turn up on Curie, 2,400 miles from the nearest from Russia where they breed. So that means not only do we have vagrants that can make it that far, but a whole flock of them did. So they're must have been communicating with each other as they flew, and somehow the whole flock got off course and made it to Curie. So that's kind of an interesting thing. Again, there's Curie. It's 60 miles west of Midway and 2,400 miles from the nearest continent. And we get a lot of Asian vagrants here. Some of you will recognize some of these. And you know, how do they get there here? And it was always thought they kind of leave the Aleutians and come around through British Columbia and down through Oregon and all. But there's more recent evidence that some of these are actually making nonstop flights from, say, the outer Aleutians straight to California or Baja. So that's kind of interesting. Some of you might recognize that bird down on the lower right, the Mendocino shrike. I'll get to that in a second here. So there's various ways that the birds can get to California. This was always thought to be the case coming around, but now there's more evidence that they come straight, and they may stop on the Aleutian Islands, which is why they get a lot of vagrants there before coming here. All of these basically, though, are switching left and right. They're kind of like dyslexic. Instead of going southeast, they're going southwest instead, and that's one of the mechanisms by which they get here. So the Mendocino shrike showed up down at Alder Creek, north of Point Arena, and I think it was 2015 or 14, and we, with the help of Bob Kiefer and his lab, we made these different conjectures of how it got here. And basically, in this case, we think it did a 180 from its normal migratory route, which would take it from breeding to wintering grounds here instead. Let's see, which one was it? One of these brings it, this one here is what we think. So the breeding range, winter range, and if you do a 180, it takes you right to the California coast. So anyway, that's kind of interesting. So over the pole instead of over the ocean. Here's my self promotion number 2, Mendo Pelagics. If you like a lot of these things that you've seen, we've got trips out of Noyo Harbor, and here's our website. And you can read our trip reports here, and you can also sign up for future trips. We have a couple coming up in August, the 15th and the 17th. 15th is a full day trip where we spend 10 hours, and 17th half day trip, and I go on all of them, and Sarah Grimes goes on most of them. And so we'll be there to tell you more stories about animals crossing the Pacific. Here's some of our recent photos of we do not just birds and mammals, but we pick up marine vertebrates and check them out. Here's our map of Noyo Canyon and the places we go. So please join us if you want to see some of this amazing marine life and organisms that we see off our coast. And another promotion is my wife's website, calgeographic.com. I think a lot of you would enjoy it because now that we're centered here in Mendocino, there's a lot of local stories of interest. The most recent one being California coastal prairies, with some great photographs of the prairie habitats here, and also information about their conservation. And here's some other stories some of you might enjoy: the Triple Junction, the Inglenook Fen, earthquake country over in Lake County in Napa, and then the Creepy Fault Creep on the Mayakama Fault, which the Mayakama Fault, as I've learned through my wife, is actually the real edge of the Pacific Plate with the North American Plate. It's just deeper down than the San Andreas, which is what we see here on the coast. So in Willits, if you go there, there's this shift of Earth, and there's all these places where it's shifted, and there's various fences that continually have to be rebuilt because they get shifted and broken. So that's kind of fun. All right, last story, leatherback turtle. And we have these show up off San Francisco in the fall. And they really like that interface between the water from San Francisco Bay and the real ocean water. And that's because it accumulates a lot of things along there. So that's where we mostly see leatherback turtles. They're uncommon and actually have gotten pretty rare. I think Richard Thornton, the captain of the Kraken, told me he's seen a couple up here. So it's something we'll be looking for off our coast too. So we always thought the turtles we saw off California go to Costa Rica, come from Costa Rica, which is the closest breeding colonies of these things. They breed on beaches like the other turtles and lay their eggs in the sand. And so they went down there and put these tags on the breeding Costa Rica turtles, and they all went south to Chile. So where are our animals going? So in order to do that, these researchers had to go catch one with a big net, put it on board, and attach a transmitter here to see where our leatherback turtles go. And the answer is to Borneo. So our leatherback turtles come from Borneo. They lay their eggs and breed in Borneo. So here's kind of the track line map of leatherback turtles, basically mostly going to Indonesia and Borneo region, and then coming all the way up to California and feeding, and then going back. And there was some evidence for a while that they all kind of went to maybe this area here for a while before going in, and I thought maybe that's a mating ground too, but I don't know. Anyway, this is what they do. And the it's a 3-year round trip of 17,000 miles. And undoubtedly they know how to work the currents to make this trip. And the other thing I'm thinking, so why do they do this? I mean, that's pretty crazy. Is again for food. They fatten up really a lot, and then they're able to make this 3-year round trip journey and lay eggs, probably without eating. And so, what is it about our system that brings them here? Well, it's this guy, Chrysaorha fuscescens, which is also called the West Coast sea nettle. It's got the most nutritious gonads of any jellyfish in the ocean. And so it's so nutritious and they're so abundant. They'll be in these big swarms like this, and they accumulate along that zone between the two water masses, that the turtles come up, eat these things, uh, fatten up, and then go for 3 years to go lay their eggs. So that's it. All my stories, and thank you for joining me.
Wow, thanks, Peter. That was you packed a lot into an hour of talk.
Is it an hour? I made an hour.
Just about exactly, I think.
Okay, good.
Fantastic.
Sometimes I go too long.
I can see why. There's a lot to talk about. All right, so let's see. Does anyone have questions after all that? I would think so, because there was an awful lot of information thrown out there. Okay, okay. The first question I see on the chat is who mows the grass on Midway?
The Navy, unfortunately.
Oh, no
Yeah,
kidding.
yep.
Wow.
They get out there and mow, and there's a big bunch of stuff about pushing chicks out of the way, and they can't mow when they're actually sitting on the eggs. But then once all the eggs have hatched, I guess they kind of move the chicks around while they mow. And
No
there's a
kidding.
golf course there too, by the way, which so anyway.
Crazy. I had a question about the albatross chicks going way back to those guys. You had some pictures that showed them getting kind of pear-shaped and partially feathered and partially downy. Do they just grow feathers over a period of time, or are they like alcids that kind of pack on the fat and then just grow all their feathers at once?
I think, most birds, what it is the real feathers come in below the down, and the down actually clings to the end of the real feathers and then breaks off. And there's a certain sequence to that. You can see that the body feathers got replaced before the head and neck feathers did.
Right.
But yeah, it's just sort of what was the other question again?
Oh, about because they put on a lot of fat for a while when they're
Yeah,
not
yeah,
growing feathers, they're just making fat and they stay downy, and then it seems like they grow all their feathers in a pretty short time.
yeah. They do. They lose that down pretty quickly. But what that triggered was to say that albatross are heavier than they ever will be. That after that last feeding that the parents do. So the parents then leave, and the chick sits there and is way too heavy to fly, and its wings aren't really developed yet either. So they sit there for something like 3 weeks practicing flight and gradually losing weight until finally they're able to lose enough weight and gain enough muscle to leave and fly out to sea. And at that point, they have to figure out where to go and what to eat, which is, to me, an amazing thing about seabirds is that most of them don't follow their parents. A few do, but most don't. So, for instance, a Cassin's auklet will be, it won't even know that, it won't even have seen the light of day because the chicks are in deep, dark burrows. Parents, the same thing. They leave them after 5 or 8 days. They get hungry, and on their own, these chicks who've never even seen the light of day have to know to go fly out to sea and find food. So that to me is a pretty remarkable adaptation.
Yeah, it is really. So here's another question, and I've seen some, I think, speculation about this before. Is did these long migrations across oceans, did those have something to do with continental drift? Were they maybe
Yeah,
a
probably.
strategy that developed when the continents were closer together, and then the birds adapted and evolved ways to continue making the same journey even though the distances got greater?
Yeah, that's what we think. That's what I think happened with that white shark, area. That
Uh-huh.
potentially there used to be a continental, white sharks have been around for 400 million years. They're older than trees. So, so there's been a lot of time for them to adapt to plate tectonic movements. I often think that maybe that spot, because no one else knows why they chose that spot, it's just kind of random, might have been along a productive area of a continent at one time. And they just kept going back there, even though the continents ended up drifting away into different places. So that's quite likely. There's that migrations, though, on the other hand, can adapt pretty quickly, I think. By quickly, I mean like hundreds of years, which is quick relative to plate tectonics. So,
Right.
I think probably there the migration routes kind of adapt a little quicker than that. So
So another question about Midway Island, is it at risk of flooding from sea level rise?
it sure is, and that's a big problem. And that one island, Turn Island. So I mentioned the naval personnel mowed the lawns. That was when I was there. Now it's all owned and operated by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But there's a lot. There's on Turn Island. There was used to be a runway. It's kind of defunct, and a seawall, and it's made of iron. But the salt water has eroded it away, so it's falling in. So they're really worried about losing Turn Island. There's some buildings there, a research station. They still have a runway that they can land small Cessnas and stuff on. So I think there's a big idea to shore up the seawall out there against climate change. But on the other hand, atolls are kind of funny. They're not like our coasts that aren't moving much. Maybe a slight uplift with tectonics, but atolls, remember, keep growing on themselves with the coral. So as time goes by, even if the sea level rises, and remember the mountain itself is uh, is dropping, so it's quite possible that they'll be fine, these atolls, because the coral, as long as the coral keeps up with the rate at which the sea levels rise, which I think it should.
Right.
Interestingly, so the Midway is part of the hotspot, which is now forming island, the Big Island, formed the Big Island, and there's now another island forming south of the Big Island. So it's a hot spot where the lava comes up and builds an island. And then the plate under there is the Pacific plate, as we know, is moving west northwest. So that islands end up leaving the hot spot and going west northwest. And by the time they reach Kauai, they've kind of eroded down. Plus, they're also sinking. So that's what causes the whole northwest Hawaiian island chain. There's a couple of places where there's still rocks above the sea level, but mostly they've gone well below. And as they keep going, there's a line that's 30 degrees north called the Darwin line, because Charles Darwin figured this out, that where the sun is not enough year round to be able to support the coral continuing to build the reef. So
Hmm.
then the atolls disappear and the seamounts go underwater and there's no more atolls. Well, Curie and Midway are pretty close. They're at like 29 degrees latitude. So I suspect that a bigger problem for those two islands is going to be their sinking and crossing the Darwin line than actual global sea level rise.
Right. So back to the Farallones, here's an interesting question. Are there surplus burrowing owls on the Farallones
Yeah,
to restore East Bay breeding populations?
yeah, that's a big, big story.
Yeah.
I don't
There's
know.
another hour talk.
It is actually. So the burrowing owls um, are being convinced to stay the winter on the Farallones because of the introduced house mouse population, which explodes in October, November there, and then completely crashes after the first big winter rains. So these young owls, they get to the Farallones, there's mice everywhere. They're like, okay, I'm going to stay. This is great. I'll stay the winter. And then, and then after the crash, they're there, and they don't. Birds don't typically migrate midwinter, so they're kind of stuck and there's nothing to eat. So they switch to ashy storm petrels that start coming in February. And, we've documented one owl killing like 30 ashy storm petrels. So, and ashy is kind of a threatened species in California. So there's a lot of consternation. And, what I'm definitely not going to get into is the big efforts recently to remove mice from the Farallones, which is quite possible because they've removed mice from much bigger islands in New Zealand. But there's all kinds of swirling controversy against that because of the use of rodenticides and so on. So that's still in the works. But the plan did finally get approved, but even Fish and Wildlife, the bureaucracy goes so slowly that and now, of course, everything's kind of stuck for at least 3 more years. So we'll see. We'll see if it ever happens. So,
Yeah, I think they were wondering about whether you could transplant burrowing owls from the Farallones to the East Bay where their numbers are
right. Well,
declining, but I think
they are doing
two
that.
problems
We've been
there.
doing that for several years. Sorry,
Yeah,
I didn't get to that question, but yes,
yeah.
we've been trapping them in November, December, and then I'm not sure where all they've released them, but I think it's around Davis, where
Uh-huh.
there historically was a good burrowing owl population, but it's kind of gone down as well.
And do they stay there or do they just fly back?
I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
I would imagine, here's a case where they could put transmitters on. It would be
Yeah.
interesting to know.
And then the other question is, has the root cause of the decline been addressed? I mean, the agriculture is wiping out their habitat, and that's really
Yeah,
the
there's a
problem.
lot of effort there. There's a big group working on in California, the state of California, trying to figure that out and putting up nest boxes.
Hmm.
The
Right.
the big issue is pesticides, probably. We
Yeah.
have got to figure out and, figure out how to not use those and bring the insect, because the burrowing owls feed a lot on insects as well, large beetles and stuff.
Right. That's a story repeated across an awful lot of different kinds of birds.
Yeah.
Populations are declining directly because of the advances in pesticides in the past 20 years.
Not to get off track, but, you know, I've sort of always been leery of GMO crops, and yet I saw a talk by uh, what's his name? Forget, he died from Alabama, and he's the premier ecologist. And
Oh,
he, who?
I can't think of the guy's name. I think I
Yeah,
know who you mean. Yeah.
we start to forget. I'll think of it. Anyway, he said that he would support GMOs if it was done in a scientific way and not for profit, because you can produce 4 times the amount of produce in an area, so you can reclaim a lot of agricultural land to native habitat. But
Hmm.
also, more importantly, you can create pesticide resistant crops, so you wouldn't need to use pesticides. The problem is it's the pesticide companies that seem to have co-opted the whole GMO thing, not the neutral scientists and stuff. So that to me is kind of a travesty that you had Monsanto, which is now Dow, in charge, sort of became the self-proclaimed in charge of GMO development, and probably their ulterior motive is to not create pesticide resistance crops. Anyway, I can go on and on about that. But I know a lot of people don't kind of want to see GMOs, but I think in this case there's an application that could be beneficial to everything.
Yeah, definitely. Uh, yeah, if you can just engineer a crop that you don't have to spray with pesticides, if the crop itself is resistant to the insects, then you can let the insects continue and feed the rest of the ecosystem.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Another GMO story, real quick, is the mice on the Farallones. It might take, the pesticide, dropping rodenticide, there's an alternative, and that's through the use of a technology called CRISPR to re-genetically program the mice so that the females produce males that are infertile. So if they can get that going through the population, apparently you'll remove your mice harmlessly. It won't be,
right,
through pesticides within a couple of years. So that's another promising way to go here.
right. They're doing the same thing with just mosquitoes. Let's
Yeah.
see, I had one more question from a viewer. How do the albatross chicks gain water? You said that when they get too much plastic, they die of thirst. How do they get their water? Is it only the every 2 week feeding they get? Is that their
Yeah,
only?
it's the fish that the albatross fish and squid do contain fresh water. Plus, albatross are a member of this group of birds called tube noses, and the tubes are actually, there's glands under there that are able to convert salt water to fresh water, and the tubes are
Huh,
so that they can excrete the salt through their tubes. And so, in that way, I'm guessing as well, the parents are able to provide the right, um, you know, salinity of water for the chicks to be okay. It also rains a lot out there, and I remember, so the birds when they're sitting there will sit for up to 3-4 weeks while during the egg stage, and they're not eating, but they're also not drinking. But when it does rain out there, they're all putting their beaks up and getting water. So that's another way they're able to get water, and probably the chicks can do that too.
interesting. A couple of people suggest the ecologist you were talking about was that E.O. Wilson.
Yeah, Wilson, thank you.
Yeah, right. He of the second greatest threat. Yeah. Prince Abbott had the question about the burrowing owls, and I think we probably addressed that.
Well, I was just wondering if we could actually get them, like they've done in Southern California, and put them in a temporary breeding enclosure and establish new breeding colonies where they were extirpated 30, 40 years ago. Um, because we could really use some owls here in the East Bay. We've created a lot of habitat, but they haven't. They've showed up during the migratory season year after year, but it really takes that effort of establish breeding colonies.
Yeah, it sounds like a good idea. I thought they were doing this. I haven't been that much in touch with the Farallones for 20 years or so, but I know early on when I was still there, we were catching them and sending them off. And I think at that point releasing them around Davis. But you know, they're still catching them and transporting them. I just don't know what the grand plan is. And
And
you should probably, guy named Jim Teets is the biologist there in the fall when this goes on. So he'd be the one to talk to about potentially bringing them there. And then you'd want to also talk to Jerry McChesney, who's there at the Don Edwards National Wildlife Refuge, because he's in charge of the Farallones, and he'd need to be involved as well. But yeah, sounds like a good idea to me.
thank you much.
Mhm.
So Anna wants to know what's the rarest bird you've seen on the ocean?
Oh, probably it's called a ringed or hornbeam storm petrel off of San Miguel Island in Southern California. Is the first record for the Northern Hemisphere.
What's it called?
Ringed storm petrel. It's a bird of the Humboldt Current off Peru.
Wow. Well, and that I'll
Well,
just
the
let
Herald
every
petrel, if that turns out to be a Herald petrel, that would be number two, I would guess.
yeah, and he's talking about a bird that we saw actually on one of the Neopelagics earlier this year in the spring, and got bird that came and made one pass, just flew by the boat and continued on. And it was on a very rough day, so challenging photographic conditions. But Roger got a couple of photos, and a couple of other guys, Colin got a good one. And so we're still trying to get an expert judgment, I guess, right? You haven't heard
Yeah,
yet,
yeah,
but
still
it's,
waiting for the people who would really be able to put the ID on it. Another good bird is off Mendo was the white-capped albatross in 1999, I think. That was off of Gualala, I think, or somewhere like that. We used to do pelagic trips where we leave Sausalito, come up here in one day, stay at the Harbor Light, and then get back on the boat and go back to Sausalito the next
yeah,
day. And it was on one of those trips we saw that bird.
nice. Well, that's great. I'm still digesting a bunch of this, and we'll be asking you questions for months, I'm sure, as I always do. And
I'll
one more,
only answer them if on a Noyo pelagic trip, so you guys
yeah,
need to sign up.
there you go. You beat me to it. I was just going to plug the Neopelagic strip because going out to sea on a boat with Peter Pyle is a lot like going back to college, only way more fun, and you learn things faster. Uh, but it is a real education. So anybody who can stand to go out to see it all, it is a magic world out there. And we're fortunate to live in one of the most productive parts of it and the easiest, most accessible parts of this ecosystem. And we've been making the most of it this year and seeing some incredible sights. I was telling before we started the talk, the whales have moved in off Mendocino, and we really saw a lot of them on the last two trips last week, including a calf humpback with its mother. So that was quite a sight. And like Peter said, we'll be going out again in mid-August. So check out noyapelagics.com. And I
All
think
right.
that's,
Yep, thank you, everyone. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
well, thank you, Peter. And again, thanks, Trey and the Noyo Center for giving me the honor of being the guest host on this. It was really a pleasure.